whole truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Have a seat. Whenever you're ready.
Ms. Kramer, can you state and spell your name for the record, please?
Yes, my name is Cynthia Kramer, Cynthia-Kramer.
And where are you currently employed, and what do you do there?
I work for the Colorado Bureau of Investigation in the Grand Junction Forensic Laboratory as a forensic biologist.
And what sort of education and training did you have to get outside of CBI to assume that job?
I have a Bachelor of Science from Colorado State University in biochemistry. I've also completed a couple of graduate level courses in endocrinology and immunology. I have been working with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation in the forensic biology section of the lab for over 20 years, at which time I have been both a DNA database analyst at the beginning of my career. I then trained in forensic serology and DNA analysis, which I've been doing for the past 16 years.
Your Honor?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but in light of Ms. Kramer's qualifications and in the interest of time, if counsel is going to ask that she be qualified as an expert in forensic serology and forensic DNA analysis, the people would have no objection. We'd stipulate as such.
Thank you.
Should be qualified as an expert in forensic serology and DNA analysis.
As part of your role as a forensic biologist at the CBI Grand Junction, do you have opportunity to do some DNA work on this case, the Mark Redwine case?
Yes, in my role as a forensic biologist with CBI, I did.
Okay. And were you aware that in July 2018, Ms. Sarah Miller at CBI ran some DNA analysis of some mixtures from the living room at Mark Redwine's house?
I'm aware that she did probabilistic genotyping interpretation on those mixtures using StarMix.
And as part of that process, did you run the quantities for those mixtures from the living room?
Yes, I did the DNA analysis portion of the lab work for that, for Sarah Miller for that report.
And does that include quantifying the DNA samples?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And can you explain to the jury what that means? And if you have to get into extraction and amplification, just let us know when you go from one topic to another.
For these particular samples that Sarah Miller did the interpretation on, I used the DNA extracts that were previously developed by Rebecca Strub. I took these DNA extracts and ran a quantitation test using our current quant test called Quantifiler Trio. I then proceeded with the rest of analysis, which included doing amplification with the Global Filer Kit, and then running the DNA on the genetic analyzer to develop profiles that were then used for interpretation.
And what is quantification? Is that how much material?
That's measuring the amount of DNA that's in the sample. So for when I started with the DNA extract, I am getting an approximate value of the DNA quantity in that DNA extract that I began with.
And typically, how is that quantity measured? Pounds, grams, picograms?
It's measured in nanograms per microliter.
And does it sometimes get measured in picograms as well?
It has in the past, yes.
Okay. And do you recall what a picogram and or a nanogram's relationship is to a gram? How many per?
I believe that it's 1,000 picograms to 1 nanogram. And I would have to double check because I did write it down. Your Honor, may I refresh my memory by looking at my notes? And it's 1 billion nanograms for 1 gram.
And this is a compound question, but I'm going to ask everyone to bear with me. Did you run the quants, determine what the quantities were for CBI items 1.1, 3.1, 5.1, and 6.1?
Yes, I did.
Okay. At this time, I'd ask the people to publish previously admitted prosecution 340, just to orient the jury about what we're talking about here. And I'd ask to move up to the body. And I'm just putting up prosecution 340 to orient the jury about what we're talking about. I doubt that you've ever seen this exhibit.
I have not.
Okay. But this exhibit refers to CBI 1. And if you recall, I'm going to ask you to tell the jury what the quants were, what the quantity of DNA material was for CBI 1.1. And if you don't remember any of the look at the batch notes, just let us know. Okay.
I would like to look at the batch notes, yes.
By all means. What was we'll look at them.
On item 1.1, the sample that was taken from item 1, the small autosomal, which is the measure that I would use to go ahead and run amplification from, was 0.99104 nanograms per microliter.
And moving on to, and this is going to be in a different part of the batch notes, what were the quantities of DNA material for CBI 6? And if you need to refresh, just let us know you're doing that.
Okay, I'm refreshing again. Item 6, the small autosomal value was 1.860971 nanograms per microliter.
On that one, were you looking at degradation or were you looking at quantity?
Oh, excuse me, I was looking at the degradation index. For small autosomal, 0.561845 nanograms per microliter.
And moving to a different part, if you need to refresh, let us know. What was the quantity of DNA material for CBI number 3?
Item 3.1 would be the derived item from that. I'm refreshing, looking at my notes. The small autosomal on that was 3.841686 nanograms per microliter.
The last one, I'm going to ask you to tell us what the quantity of DNA material was CBI number 5. Can you let us know what that is and let us know if you need to refresh?
Item 5, refreshing my memory from my notes, the quantity of small autosomal DNA was 0.766318 nanograms per microliter.
And again, a nanogram is a billionth of a gram?
Yes.
Okay. And you didn't run quants for CBI 2 in this batch, right?
No, I did not.
Probably because that wasn't a mixture on its way to star mix, correct?
I don't recall if that one was a mixture or not.
Thank you. You can take that down. You were also asked to do DNA analysis on a Miller Lite beer can. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And do you recall who asked you to do that DNA analysis on the beer can?
Yes, that was submitted through the sheriff's office, but the original request came from the defense team.
Right. So you were aware that it was something that we had asked that be done, right?
Yes.
Okay. And can you explain okay, now we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of DNA. Can you explain what loci are, how many loci we got per person, and what alleles are?
Your Honor?
Yes.
Objection. It's going to be cumulative. The jury's already heard from 3 DNA experts from the same agency as Ms. Kramer. And if we're starting with the basics of DNA, I fear that it's repetitive, unnecessary, and cumulative.
Yeah, I'd like you to just fly through this part if you can.
Then I'll fly through it, but I'm going to ask a little leeway to
I'll let you ask some questions to make sure it's understood.
Okay. When you're doing DNA analysis, you take known samples and you compare them to other samples, correct?
I developed profiles from the evidence samples, which are called question samples, and compare those to the profiles developed from known samples, which are called reference samples.
And in this case, when we're talking about the beer can, the known samples were people involved in the case, correct?
That's correct.
That was like Corey Redwine, Dylan Redwine, and Mr. Mark Redwine, correct?
Yes, those were 3 of the references of 5 that I did receive.
And the question sample was the Miller Lite beer can, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And basically the way this process works, and I know you'll tell me if I'm getting it wrong, is you look at the DNA profile of the question sample, the beer can, at 23 different locations on the DNA molecule, correct?
I'm looking at that many locations on the DNA molecule. Now, whether or not I get results is a different story based on the quantity of DNA that I recover from the sample.
Right. And we'll get to that in a second. So you look at the 23 locations on the DNA molecule from the beer can, and then you compare that to 23 locations on the DNA molecule from known samples, including Mr. Mark Redwine, correct?
That's a bit simplified, but yes, first I would look at the question sample and determine whether or not it's single source originating from only one person, or if it's a mixture originating from more than one individual. If there's not enough information at enough locations on the DNA, I may determine that that profile is not interpretable as well. I then use, if I'm going to, excuse me, let me back up. If there's an inclusion, for example, somebody's DNA is consistent with the questioned profile, I then may determine significance of that inclusion using the likelihood ratio.
And in this case, did you determine that the question sample, that is from the Miller Lite beer can, was a mixture or single source?
It was a single source sample. It was a partial profile. That means I was not able to develop information at all the locations on the DNA because I did not have very much DNA recovered from the sample.
And let me break that down for a sec. That means that out of the 23 locations on the DNA molecule, you only got information at a number of those 23 locations, not at all 23, right?
That's right. On that particular sample, I had information at 6 of the autosomal locations and 1 from a gender-determining location. 7
locations, or as you call it in the business, 7 loci.
That's correct.
And that's in somewhat contrast to the known profiles where you get DNA information at all 23 locations, correct?
Often, yes, you do. I've had some samples from older cases where I don't always get a full profile on the references, but typically you do get a full profile for the references.
And you developed enough of a partial profile of the Miller Lite beer can to do some comparisons amongst the known profiles, correct?
That's correct.
And can you explain to this jury whom you were able to exclude from contributing DNA to item 215, the Miller Lite beer can?
Yes, I took the sample from the Miller Lite beer can, which, like I previously said, was a partial DNA profile that was single source, and I was able to determine that there was no DNA consistent with Mark Redwine, Corey Redwine, Dylan Redwine, Elaine Redwine, or David Stone. All those individuals were excluded from that DNA profile.
And Your Honor, at this time I'd ask to approach with what's been previously marked as Defendants 1864 and 1865.
You may.
Do you recognize those, Ms. Kramer?
Yes, I do.
Are they electropherograms?
Yes.
Printouts? Are they fair and accurate representations of the electropherograms that were used as part of your analysis in the spear can?
Yes, they are.
Move for the admission of 1864 and 1865.
No objection, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right, they'll be admitted.
And permission to publish.
Sure.
You see what we got going on here, Ms. Kramer?
Yes.
Okay. I believe this is 1864. Does this look like the E-gram, the electropherogram from the Miller Lite beer can? Maybe you need to look at the form.
It does.
And these numbers up here, do those represent different locations on the DNA molecule?
Yes, those letters and numbers are the names of the different locations on the DNA.
And safe to say that if you have a known sample and a question sample, if someone doesn't match at one location, they're not a match, they're not contributing DNA to that material, correct?
Typically not, yes.
Okay. And on the beer can, at this location on the DNA molecule from the beer can, D22, that's what I'm going to call it, so it goes on. What's going on with this peak and this numerical value here? Can you explain that to the jury?
The numerical value is the number of repeats at that particular location. So it's considered a 17 at D22. And I would be looking at the reference to see if that individual also had 17 repeats called there. The number under the 17, the 110, is the peak height of that particular peak on the electropherogram.
So whomever left DNA on the Miller Lite beer can is a 17. They have a numerical value of 17 at this location on the DNA molecule, correct?
They could have a second sister allele that's dropping out, but they would have at least a 17, and it might be 17 plus another allele.
And when we look at 1865, that's Mr. Redwine's known DNA profile, correct?
Yes, it is.
And what is he at DS22?
He's a 1519.
Right, which is obviously not a 17, correct?
That's correct.
It just won't go back. You can't just set it on top. Well, I mean, the stand is what I was talking about.
Okay, all right.
You know, and I've got pretty bad eyes.
On deck today.
All right. Looks like somebody might need it in the future. That's good. We'll play with it. Okay. Over there.
So safe to say, your analysis is that Mr. Mark Redwine can be excluded from contributing DNA to this beer can, correct?
That's right.
As well as Dylan Redwine and Corey as well, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Can you explain to the jury what CODIS is, please?
CODIS stands for the Combined DNA Index System. That is the DNA database that provides electronic storage for forensic profiles. It's used to generate investigative leads by searching forensic profiles against convicted offender profiles to develop investigative leads for cases.
And typically, how does CODIS get utilized by an analyst like yourself?
It is used for DNA profiles developed from forensic unknowns that are eligible for entry. They have to be clearly associated with the alleged crime. They also have to meet a certain threshold of completeness. For example, very partial profiles are not eligible for entry because due to the lack of information, they would generate too many extraneous hits that would not provide any real information, too many candidate matches that would be more like spurious matches because there's so little information, kind of like if you tried to send something through the mail with an incomplete address, like 128 Brown Street, could match a lot of 128 Brown Streets in the United States without any additional information like Durango, Colorado, zip code, PO box, that sort of thing.
And that's why the CODIS program, if you enter in a sample that's not up to that threshold, then CODIS will not conduct the comparison, correct? It stops right there.
It won't be eligible for entry. You just wouldn't input it, period. It wouldn't be eligible.
But even if you did input it, CODIS wouldn't carry out that task, correct?
It wouldn't go up to the national DNA index system. CODIS has different levels. There's a local level, a state level, and the national level. The national level, you have to have at least 8 locations on the DNA for it to be eligible, so it wouldn't even make it to the national level. You could attempt to put it in the state level, and you might be surprised at how many matches come back, spurious matches that don't mean anything due to the fact that there's so little information in there.
And I want to talk briefly, and I think you touched on this, so I might ask you to reiterate it. To enter information, to enter samples into the CODIS system, it sounds like they can be compared against known samples on a national level and a state level. Is that correct?
That's correct. If a profile is eligible to go all the way up to the national level, it will be searched at both the state and national level regularly.
And to meet the requirements to be entered into CODIS, it's got to be above a particular analytic threshold, correct?
It has to have a certain number of locations. Like I said, it has to have at least 8 locations to go into the national DNA index system. It also has to reach a certain level of probabilistic type threshold for statistics, so that way you know you're not going to come back with a lot of spurious matches that don't mean anything. So it has to meet a certain frequency for the profile to be eligible. And
is another requirement to enter a sample into CODIS that it be associated with a putative offender or crime scene?
Yes. Unfortunately, sometimes you don't know exactly who the putative perpetrator is, so that's when you have to look at whether or not the profile is clearly associated with the particular scene, so that way you're not just entering random people into the database that don't belong in there. And by random people, I mean random profiles from forensic profiles.
Or a crime scene as well, correct?
Correct.
Now, you've already told the jury that to do a national NDIS search on CODIS, you need information at 8 locations, correct?
You have to have the 8 locations, and it has to meet that particular threshold of rarity, that frequency threshold that I was talking about for entry into the national DNA index system.
For a state run, to enter something and to do a SDIS, to enter CODIS and have it compared against state data, you only need information at 5 locations, correct?
I can't recall the exact number of locations for state, but it also has a frequency threshold that it must meet to be eligible for state as well.
And safe to say, all CODIS work is governed by Colorado Bureau of Investigation standard operating procedures, correct?
The state database, yes, is governed by that and the National DNA Index policies and procedures. So FBI oversees the whole NDIS on down.
And would looking at Colorado Bureau of Investigation DNA 11.2 CODIS casework analysts, page 5, refresh your recollection as to how many loci are required to run a state run on CODIS? I got it right here.
Okay, yes.
I'm going to ask you to review that document, the standard operating procedures in section 11.2 CODIS casework.
Okay.
And draw your attention particularly to, I think it's paragraph 5 towards the top on the page I handed you. Have you reviewed that?
I have.
How many loci are required? How many loci are required to do a state run?
It requires 5 loci to return a match, but it's also coupled with the match rarity estimate. That's the frequency threshold that I was talking about previously.
Okay. So you got to have information at 5 different spots on the molecule, and you have to meet another requirement. Explain to the jury what that is.
That's a frequency match rarity estimate. I can't recall the actual calculation off the top of my head, but that's a frequency threshold that ensures that the matches aren't going to just be spurious matches returned.
And that analytic threshold, is that defined or at least described in other CBI standard operating procedures?
I don't recall if it's in other ones, but I know it's in this one right in front of me.
Okay. Drawing your attention again to 1.8, I believe it's 6.4. This is over your right shoulder. It's the electropharogram from the beer can, correct?
Yes.
And safe to say, on the beer can, we have information at D3S, as denoted by that 15 and 125, correct?
Yes.
And explain to the jury what that peak is at the Y. I think you briefly addressed that. But.
That's a gender determining loci specific for males. It's called the Y-indel. That loci does not count towards the, the 5 loci. It has to be the autosomal loci, which are the non-gender determining ones.
But the one thing we know from this loci is that the contributor to this beer can was a male, according to this, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And then 2 down from that, we have information at D8S, correct?
Yes.
As denoted by the 12 and the 202, right?
That's correct.
So we can't count the Y, but we can count the DS3, we can count the D8S, so we're up to 2. And then when we get to the next row on D2S, D19, and TH01, we have information at all those locales as well, correct?
You have information at 3 there.
Right. So at that point, we're up to 5 loci, correct, where we have information?
Correct.
6, but we don't count the Y, correct?
That's right.
And then on the next page, at DS22, we have information there as well, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So we have information at 7 loci, 6 of those which could count towards whether or not to enter this information into the CODIS, state-run CODIS, correct?
That's correct.
Did you enter this into CODIS?
I did not.
You did some other work on this case, correct?
I did.
And do you recall doing kind of a serology analysis on an area rug, CBI item 47?
Yes.
And if at any point when we're talking here, if you need to refresh your recollection with your laboratory reports, just let us know.
Okay.
Do you remember the area rug number 47, or?
I took some notes on it. I don't have it committed to my memory.
Okay. What, if any, conclusions did you come to regarding stains and characteristics of blood on item 47, the area rug?
I examined both the top side and the bottom side of the rug, and I did not visually see any blood-like staining.
Was that the end of your analysis?
That was.
During the same batch of analysis, did you do some work on some hairs, for instance, hairs from the master bedroom?
Yes, I did.
And what was your conclusion based upon your expert opinion regarding human hairs from the master bedroom?
Excuse me, may I refresh my recollection from my report, Your Honor?
Yes.
Well,
I was able to determine that there was one hair from the master bedroom that was suitable for nuclear DNA analysis, which I later did DNA analysis on.
did you determine that one hair was also not of human origin?
Yes.
How about as to item 48.3, hairs marked from the bathroom? What was your conclusion regarding those?
That none of those items were suitable for nuclear DNA, and I had both human and non-human hairs.
And how about item 48.5, hairs from upstairs bedroom?
On those, the hairs were not suitable for nuclear DNA testing, and there were also hairs of non-human origin.
At a later date, did you do an analysis of item 58, a Band-Aid?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And can you explain to the jury what your findings were regarding serology and who, if anyone, could be included or excluded as contributing to that sample on the Band-Aid, item 58?
Yes, that Band-Aid was presumptive positive for blood. I then developed a DNA profile which was consistent with Mark Redwine. I determined the likelihood ratio that the partial DNA profile developed from the cutting from the Band-Aid is at least 8.2 septillion times more likely to be observed if it originated from Mark Redwine than if it originated from an unknown, unrelated individual, which provided very strong support. Elaine Redwine, David Stone, Corey Redwine, and Dylan Redwine were all excluded as contributors to that profile.
I think that's all I have for this witness on direct.
All right, Cross? Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Kramer.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
Good.
CBI is an accredited crime lab, right?
Yes, we are.
So that means you engage in best practices, have validated procedures, annual audits, and so on?
Yes.
And the work coming out of CBI is based on reliable DNA testing data interpretation and scientifically sound measures. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Fair to say that CBI uses the best detection instrumentation available in the industry?
I would assume so, yes.
And all the CBI analysts, including you, complete proficiency testing and go through rigorous training and updated continuing education?
Yes, we do.
So the jury's heard a lot about DNA analysis in this case, but I'm going to hit on some of the specific areas that counsel raised on direct, okay?
Okay.
In this case, CBI has done a lot of work, not only at the crime scene, but also a bunch of different items of evidence, right?
Yes, we have.
And it's involved many analysts and a lot of personnel from CBI.
Yes.
And you yourself have worked on a lot of different things, some of which were covered in direct.
Yes.
Counsel asked you about a rug that you looked at. Do you recall that from a report dated February 3rd, 2015?
Yes, I do.
And were you aware that different locations at the scene, specifically items 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6, had all tested presumptively positive for blood?
Yes, I was aware.
And then at the lab, there's another round of testing done on different items, right?
I'm not sure which items.
Sorry. At the lab, there can be additional rounds of testing based on CBI's analysis or upon request.
Right, yes.
And you were asked to look at the rug in this case.
Yes, I was.
And counsel asked you if you just looked at the rug and that was it?
Yes.
That's what I heard on direct, right?
Yes.
Fair to say that you already knew the rug had been tested with luminol from the scene?
It had been reported on the request for lab exam that it was already examined at the scene. I'm unsure which test it had been used to test it for blood.
So either luminol or phenolphthalein?
Most likely, yes.
And was that the reason why, or a factor you considered in deciding not to test it further after your visual examination?
That and the fact that I believe that the rug was not so dark colored in nature that I wouldn't be able to see the blood visually.
And then counsel referenced the number of hairs that were recovered from different locations in the residence. Do you recall that line of questioning?
Yes.
And you carefully analyzed each one, am I right?
Yes.
And I'm not going to, well, the hairs from the master bedroom, you ultimately found no hair eligible for nuclear DNA testing, am I right?
I'd have to go back and look at that one again real quick.
Sure. My report's dated February 3rd, 2015, if that helps.
Thank you, it does.
Sure.
One of the hairs was suitable for nuclear DNA, which I then later did on a later report.
And what were the results of that test?
I'm trying to figure out which hair that was.
Hmm. 48.1, if that.
It does. Okay, thank you. Yes, there it is. Okay. I was unable to develop a DNA profile from that particular hair.
And what does that mean in layperson terms?
What that means is I took it all the way through the testing process, and when I developed the electrophoregram like you saw up here on the display, I did not have any genetic information at any of the locations.
And fair to say, each of the items that counsel just went through with you, there's no evidentiary value presented based on your analysis?
That's right. From either I had no DNA recovered, or I wasn't able to develop a profile, or I had a profile that had so little information that it was not interpretable.
Let's move on then. In your March 10th, 2020 report, you document the results of the test regarding the Band-Aid.
Yes.
And can you just reiterate again what the results of the DNA analysis of the Band-Aid was?
That it was consistent with Mark Redwine.
And this was a Band-Aid recovered from his garage?
I don't specifically recall where it was recovered myself.
You would agree with me, of course, that DNA analysis has become particularly enhanced over the years, right?
It's very sensitive.
So in the years that you've been in the business, we've come a long way in terms of DNA technology.
Yes.
And you can get reliable DNA results from a very small number of cells. Is that fair to say?
Yes, you can.
And on the flip side, if you have too much DNA in a sample, then you have to dilute it down so it doesn't overload the system. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you assisted Sarah Miller in the probabilistic genotyping on 1.1, 3.1, 5.1, and 6.1. Is that right?
Yes, I assisted with the DNA analysis in the lab.
Counsel took you through each one of the quants for those, 1.1, 3.1, 5.1, and 6.1.
Yes.
You can look at your report if you want, but I'm not going to get that detail. Did you have enough information there to develop DNA profiles?
Yes.
For each one?
Yes.
And to be clear, the quantity of the DNA present cannot be used to infer the possible source of the substance, whether it be blood, semen, saliva, and so on, right?
That's correct. It cannot.
Counsel just briefly asked you about star mix. I'm only going to ask you a couple questions about it, okay?
Okay.
Is it fair to say it's a computer program that can help analyze genotypes of a mixture of individuals present at one loci?
Yes, it's a tool that helps the DNA analysts break down DNA mixtures into their individual components.
And a program such as StarMix has made it possible to interpret more complex mixtures than you could 10, 20 years ago.
That's correct.
And it's a computer, so perhaps not surprisingly, it does more calculations than a human could do in a very short amount of time.
Yes.
But to do so, you need enough DNA for the StarMix program to run.
Yes, you do.
And there was enough DNA in 1.1, 3.1, 5.1, and 6.1 for StarMix to work and produce results.
Yes.
Let's turn to the discussion about the beer cans and direct examination, okay? And this would be a report dated March 17, 2020, is that right?
That's correct.
The defense had requested the test of the beer can, and that request came in on February 19, 2020, is that right?
That is correct.
And you talked about addresses and needing to have enough information to know what address you're looking for in the United States.
Correct.
Would another analogy be, for example, Social Security numbers? So if I said, how many people here, and don't raise your hand, by the way, but how many people here have a number 1 in their Social Security number, or a number 1 in the first place of their Social Security number? That's one location out of 9.
That's right.
And then if I said, how many of you have a 1 in the one place and a 4 in the second place, that's another location.
That's right.
But if I only gave those 2 locations, it wouldn't be enough information perhaps for us to weed out everybody in the world and just get the one person with that Social Security number.
That's correct.
So although the loci in current DNA testing are far more than just 9, it's the same kind of premise, right?
That's correct. You want enough information that you can discriminate between individuals to hopefully narrow it down to the individual that it originated from.
Because if you do the Social Security example and you put in the 1 and the 4 and run it nationwide, presumably you're going to get a lot more people than if you put in the 9-digit Social Security number that starts with the 1, 4, and goes all the way through.
That's right.
Let's talk about CODIS a little bit. Counsel asked you about who can be found within CODIS, right?
Correct.
What are the reasons that there are restrictions on what profiles can be put into CODIS?
Some of the reasons are you don't want to put people in there that are not necessarily eligible to be in there. For example, we don't put victims in there, and this is all based on the federal legislation for the database. I believe it's the DNA Act of, I can't recall if it's 1994, might be, that limits who can go in, which profiles are eligible. So you can't just put anybody in there. For example, in the forensic unknown, we can't put in victims, we can't put in consensual partners, people that are not related necessarily to that particular crime scene. It has to originate from something that's associated with the crime scene.
So sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's fairly tight restrictions on what profiles or whose profiles can be put into CODIS, right?
That's correct.
I can't say to you, for example, I want to keep an eye on Mr. Johnson, so can you do me a favor and put his DNA profile in CODIS, right?
Right. No, we can't use it as like a fishing expedition like that.
And similarly, there's on the other end of that, there's limitations regarding the integrity of the samples that can be put into CODIS, am I right?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
I guess when we talk about loci and frequency thresholds, those are things that have to be considered in determining whether a sample is eligible to be uploaded into CODIS.
Yes, those are, because like your example with the Social Security, if you put in too little information, you're going to get a lot of extraneous matches that may not mean anything.
Right. So in the Social Security example, I tell you, or I ask you, can you put in the 1 and the 4? Well, let's change it up a little bit. It's not me. Someone from a sheriff's office says, can you put in the 1 and the 4? You wouldn't do that because it's not eligible for CODIS under this hypothetical, right?
Correct.
And in part, you wouldn't do it because you would end up with a long list of people, and the system is designed to protect people from that long list then being produced to law enforcement just to run out and investigate everyone, right?
That's right. That's why we have the frequency thresholds, the match rarity estimate as part of the threshold of what can go in as well.
Right. So can you talk to the jury just briefly about frequency thresholds and why that protection is in place?
That's so you don't end up with a lot of spurious matches. You don't want to end up with so many matches that none of them are meaningful. You want to put the profiles in and hopefully develop meaningful investigative information, and that is part of the reason why those thresholds exist as part of an eligibility requirement for CODIS entry.
How many, and tell me if this is not an appropriate question in terms of the DNA terminology, but how many cells were on that beer can?
Your Honor, may I refresh my recollection with my notes?
Yes.
I did go back and look at the quantity on this sample, and the total nanograms of DNA that I extracted from the beer can, I extracted approximately 4.5 cells.
4.5.
That's right.
Was that eligible for uploading into CODIS based on that?
It was not eligible for based on the way the profile looked and the match rarity estimate.
So, just to be clear, you weren't able to upload the beer can into CODIS?
Correct.
Your Honor, just one moment. But you were able to conclude, based on the locations you had on the beer can, that it didn't match Mark Redwine, right?
That's correct.
So, fair to say, in your expert opinion, not his beer can, right?
Fair to say that it's not his DNA on the beer can.
That's why you're the scientist and I'm just the attorney. Fair to say, Dylan Redwine's DNA was not on that beer can either.
That's right.
Okay. I have nothing further from Ms. Kramer. Thank you, ma'am.
By all means. Did you try to enter the beer can into CODIS?
I didn't see that information in my notes from when I developed my report. Taking that into consideration, I looked at CODIS the other day and looked at the match rarity estimate just to double check to make sure I didn't need to do an amended report, and it did not meet the match rarity estimate.
And I know you testified that, but my question is, did you try to enter it into CODIS, understanding that if you enter something that CODIS won't accept, CODIS won't do the analysis?
No, based on the limited information, I don't believe that I had entered it previously, but I wanted to double check to make sure it really was not eligible.
And as far as whether or not to enter certain samples into CODIS, the CBI analysts do have the ability to exercise discretion, correct?
That's correct.
And discretion as far as whether or not a particular sample is associated with a particular crime scene or anything like that, correct?
For this particular profile, it was more the fact that there was so much information that could have been dropping out of the sample based on the peak heights of that profile.
In exercising your discretion, did you do any research or did you contact law enforcement about where this came from or what it was associated with?
I had that information already that it was associated with an area on the side of the mountain where some of Dylan's belongings had been found.
Nothing further, Judge.
Any questions from the jury? And this witness is excused.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kramer.
May I be excused from my subpoena as well, Your Honor?
That's what I was trying to say.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Approach for scheduling?
Yeah, let's do that. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take just a 10-minute recess. I really don't want you going downstairs because I don't want to waste that much time getting down. So you can talk, you can hang out, just hang out there. Okay? Yes.
Can I approach for one moment with the scope?
Yeah. It's just we need to set something up before the next witness. We're going to do another video witness that should be very quick.